everyone. It's great to have you with us again for the VLGA Connect Governance Update, brought to you by Hunt and Hunt Lawyers. And joining me to talk about all the governance-related, I say that loosely, news of the week, Stephen Cooper. Hello, Stephen.
Hello, Chris. We might cast a wide net today.
We tend to. I've looked back at a couple of our most previous ones and thought, how have we managed to bring that in under the governance umbrella? I think it's a pretty broad church, isn't it?
We're nearly a sport-free zone today, though, Chris, to the best of my knowledge and belief, but that might change in the next little while.
Well, true, because that's one of the beauties of this. We don't really know where it's going to go, do we? Or sometimes we don't even know where it's going to start. I just said to Steve before we started recording, what are we going to commence on this week? We're going to commence on a conflict of interest story out of New South Wales. I know you've been following this, Steve, and we do like to dissect some of these conflict of interest issues that get people in a bit of hot water. This one involves the recently retired Chief of Police in the state of New South Wales.
Quite incredible story, Chris, on the ABC website with an article written by Sean Rubenstein Dunlop regarding the participation by the former Commissioner Mick Fuller in some racehorse syndicates, which is not an illegal activity, we should hasten to point out.
No, but how has this got him in a spot of bother, Steve? What's the problem here?
Well, there's sort of a suggestion that the people a couple of suggestions. One, that there was a failure to declare, and Mr. Fuller, to be fair, his story is that he's complied with the various New South Wales parliamentary requirements, and that's not for us to really comment on. The other is that perhaps he might have exercised a bit more due diligence in regard to the people with whom he was partnering in these racehorse syndicates, because there are people involved in high-risk activities such as liquor outlets, gaming, and indeed the head of News Limited in Australia is also a participant in one of the syndicates.
So I think, given all of that, though, there are some real repercussions here, because the latest I've heard is that it's been announced that Mr. Fuller won't be considered for a position with Racing New South Wales, which was potentially going to be his one of his post-police commissioner career roles. So this really has had a serious outcome for him, hasn't it? Whether it's followed policy or not.
You'd have to imagine it would have been politically pretty difficult for the government to sort of oversee his appointment to that board with this sort of emerging information. I think for me, Chris, there's a couple of much bigger issues than just the conflict of interest. I suppose the reminder that I took out of this was that sometimes we look at conflict of interest at the point where we've got a transaction and say, have I a conflict or not? Therefore, I should manage it. And what you see in regard to the article in the ABC website is comments like, well, I didn't make any money from it. I complied with the rules. And that's because we have an over focus on direct or perceived conflict of interest, and not enough focus on a potential conflict of interest.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, here's an example of where it can have a particularly noticeable outcome. A lot of these things probably never come to light because they're not as public, correct? But the lesson here is to, when in doubt, err on the side of caution.
Well, I think so, but I think also a reminder that if you're holding a public office, maybe you don't have quite the same latitude as a member of the general public in the way that you conduct your personal business. In this particular case, I mentioned before about the fact that some of the other syndicate members were involved in, gaming and liquor, high-risk activities for the police. It is not unlikely that New South Wales Police would be involved in matters regarding these people with investigations. There is a likelihood of a potential conflict of interest. I'll go back to the other example I mentioned before too, Chris, that John Hartigan, the head of News Limited Australia, is in one of the horses. Now, we talk about the media as the fourth estate, so the other three being the legislature, the executive and the judiciary, and the separation that's necessary. And clearly, for me, a police commissioner being in a syndicate with the head of a major news outlet might cause members of the general public to say, is that reporting as fair as it could be? And I guess an erosion of trust in both the media and in the police force and government. So this sort of translates to local government too, because again, it's not unusual that someone would say, would you like to be in a horse syndicate? There's people that you know are going to be in it. But maybe a bit of due diligence about, well, could this cause a problem down the track? What's the trust implications for the organisation might be, really worth thinking about.
So much of this is about perception, isn't it?
It's all about perception, Chris.
You've just reminded me, in talking about the Fourth Estate, the story we recently talked about some local mayors who are also radio hosts and reporting on local events. And it's perhaps an angle of that particular story that I hadn't considered at the time, but it bears thinking about.
Yeah, and it's that. Let's move ahead and just plug Fast Track, Chris, because we're going to be talking about trust at Fast Track on the 18th of March, and I think that's a really key theme to look at. Choices that we make through that lens of public trust is often a really good first start.
All right, we'll come back to Fast Track when we do our wrap up at the end, but that is coming up on the 18th of March, and I understand the places are filling pretty fast, so much so you've had to add some new ones. I wanted to go on to another story that you picked up this week, and I'm not at all drawing a link between the one we were just talking about and this one, but this concept of grey corruption and a corruption index is being discussed in light of what now seems the unlikelihood of an integrity commission coming through federal parliament, at least in this term. What do they mean by grey corruption when they use that term, Steve?
I think, Chris, it's that notion that of conduct that doesn't necessarily cross the line into criminality or into people losing their jobs, but basically decisions that are made for a purpose other than the public interest. A direction of the resources of government away from where they're best used, decisions being made on the basis of grace and favour rather than, merit, if you like.
And this particular article that you drew my attention to draws a link between grey corruption or government corruption and economic stagnation, I think was the
yeah, well, it was in the context that Australia has now fallen to 18th in the world on the international index of trust, if you like, and the article in The Age, which I presume will be in the show notes, Chris, talked about the consequences of corruption being increased uncertainty for, the private sector in markets, the fact that government spending might be influenced in the way that I just talked about, and the fact that inevitably when we uncover corruption, be it on a grand scale or locally, it requires more red tape and regulation to ensure that that corruption doesn't occur again. So at a time when we're trying to reduce red tape, corruption is the sort of factor that makes government sort of unnecessarily large, if you like. One of the real features of that is, and if we go back to culture, sometimes things can happen in an organisation and you just say, look, I'll let that go, it's not important. But that's why it is really significant for anyone in the public sector to kind of, if your gut tells you something's not right, to follow it through, because there is actually a public good in, in making sure that we ask the right questions about how decisions are made and resources allocated.
Yes, well said. There's been a few articles that have caught our eye this week that are worth mentioning, and a couple of things we talked about last week that I will come back to, the Sex Work Act in particular. But firstly, this extraordinary story out of the UK about post office masters being accused of confiscating money. I think, money's gone missing. It's turned out this extraordinary number of people have been held to account and suffered really serious consequences for what has turned out to be a system, as in a software system deficiency.
Yeah.
This just boggled my mind. I had heard nothing about it, Steve.
So, Chris, if you were thinking about your archetypal criminal, the person you're not thinking about is a sub-postmaster at the corner shop in England. So these are people in Great Britain who might have the corner shop and they've taken out a post office licence really to enable people in their communities to buy a stamp, to post letters, to do those sort of transactions that you do at the post office. And it turned out that what was the Royal Mail and then has been privatised and become the Post Office. And it is interesting that this all happened while the privatisation was going on, Chris. Prosecuted 736 sub-post agency people for, as you say, there's a word for it. Stealing money, basically.
They were prosecuted for theft, fraud, and false accounting on account of a system that actually was failing them, but no one seemed prepared to recognise that.
No, and that's the point, that there was no checking that maybe the computer was wrong, and it turns out the computer was wrong. Of the 736, it's worth saying most of those businesses didn't come back. Many communities lost their sub-post office. 4 people have taken their own lives. Like, this is an extraordinary scandal. But also, while that was going on, some of the leadership of the post office, their careers were elevated, and they've really suffered no consequence for all of this.
Yes. There's really 2 halves to this, isn't there? It's quite mind-blowing when you read through it. And I do recommend you read this story from The Guardian. We'll put the link in the show notes. It's been described as the most widespread miscarriage of justice in British history. That's pretty extraordinary cool.
Oh, incredible, Chris. And there's so many takeaways. And I guess one comes back to my early career, where I had a boss who was an accountant, who occasionally would say to me, even when there's a computer printout, check it. Why? Check it. Oh, okay. Now, I'm not saying that people need to check every computer printout, but in installation, I would presume most rates officers, before they send rate notices out, check a sample. There is an element of due diligence that goes with not just trusting what the computer gives you, just to make sure that the data looks okay. The fact that no one said, why have we suddenly got 700 sub-post office people stealing money from us? Doesn't that seem a little unusual?
Absolutely. No, nobody did. The footnote to this, Steve, is the extraordinary amount of money that is now going to be paid out in compensation. But as I understand it from a follow-up article, the software company has not been held to account in any serious way.
My understanding is the Fujitsu organisation, with their Horizon product, have gone onwards and upwards, Chris, and continue to garner work from the post office.
Yeah. I see a mini-series coming on about this, probably arriving on Stan or Foxtel or somewhere in the not-too-distant future.
I would say so, sadly, Chris, because tragedy can make the best TV.
Yeah. All right. Again, link in the show notes. It really is quite unbelievable, folks. Take a few minutes to read that story and just see how it can go so horribly wrong. You wouldn't believe it if you didn't realise this was a true story. You'd think someone had made it up. Okay, a few news events this week closer to home that are worth commenting on, Steve. The long-term councillor at Indigo Shire and former mayor of a number of terms, Jenny O'Connor, resigned at the start of this week. I've had the pleasure to work with Jenny over a few years. Terrific operator, great, very effective from my perspective. From what I saw, very effective as a mayor, has retired from local government after 10 years. That'll trigger a countback at Indigo, and we wish Jenny all the best for whatever she decides to do next.
Absolutely, Chris, and echo what you say, that Jenny's reputation for being effective and hardworking is substantial.
I did notice she announced it on Twitter, and there's quite a bit of discussion and lots of questions too. Someone asked, "Is she doing this to make a run at the federal election?" She's denied that that's the case, and is very supportive of the current independent member up there. Helen Haynes is the person, I believe. So good luck to Jenny. Goulburn Mulwari Council in New South Wales, I'm never sure if I'm saying that right, is the latest council following the last round of New South Wales elections to be losing its general manager stroke CEO. This happens as part of the political cycle. I'm not sure what the circumstances here are in particular, but Warwick Bennett, who's been in local government for nearly 50 years, it's 46 years this year, Steve, so very experienced operator, been the GM at Golden Mulwarry for 8 years, and he's stepping down in July. So all the best to him.
Absolutely, Chris.
And I should say, he has said in his statement that he's seeking new career opportunities. So he's not done yet, and I suspect with a career like that, he won't be lost to local government in some form. Now, Steve, this one also caught my eye this week. The mayoral campaign for asylum seekers currently living in Australian communities, some of whom have been waiting for a decade almost to have their applications processed. A group of mayors from across the country, led by Jim Mametti, the mayor at Greater Dandenong, he's the chair of the group, have launched this campaign called the Back Your Neighbour campaign, and the timing is no mistake. It's in the lead up to the federal election, to raise awareness of the plight of these people and to do something concrete to help them out. Their point is that they've been living in the community, they've become part of the fabric of the community. That needs to be recognised in some way, and the way these people are dealt with fairly.
Yeah, interesting, and a really effective advocacy style by those mayors and councils to band together and to give that some branding, Chris. I also noticed recently that the Hobart City Council has offered to take up the asylum seekers that are currently housed in the Park Hotel in Melbourne, who got some extra publicity when Novak Djokovic was housed there. So, yeah, that's an interesting take by a city council to really step in on a piece of federal responsibility.
Absolutely. So well done to them. We'll watch how that campaign plays out in the lead up to the election. They've said they're going to be active, advocating with all federal politicians and candidates on that issue. As you say, that Park Hotel issue with Novak Djokovic recently certainly heightened the awareness of that particular issue. And it's not lost on me also, Steve, that you just mentioned Hobart again. We seem to be mentioning Hobart a lot lately for some reason.
Oh, I don't know. We might have to do some work around Hobart, Chris.
You might have to go to Hobart and see what's going on, because clearly there's
if I have to.
All right, so watch out for that campaign. What else have we got to talk about this week, Steve? I know social media comes up quite a bit. And I did notice on Valentine's Day some very interesting social media activity in Canada at the local government level. There's a bit of a love affair going on between the city of Edmonton and the city of Calgary. Did you see that?
I found that interesting on social media, Chris, because apparently historically it's not been a love affair. That they're 3 hours apart but quite fierce rivals, Calgary and Edmonton.
Yes.
So what did they do on Valentine's Day?
Well, hopefully JLF can put this image up now as we speak about it. So the city of Edmonton posted a Wordle GIF. Am I saying that right? Is it GIF?
Yeah, I'd say it's a GIF.
Which basically ended up showing the word adore. Basically, dear city of Calgary, we adore you, says the city of Edmonton. And then the city of Calgary responded with its own love letter in return. You took the Wordles right out of our mouth. We adore you too. Happy Valentine's Day, with a Wordle screen with red squares that made the shape of a heart. I just thought it was a lovely distraction.
It's not the typical bureaucratic kind of social media management. Can I take that in another direction, Chris? I've been following recently, and I'd recommend to not only election nerds but anyone to follow the Australian Electoral Commission Twitter account, because 32,000 other people do. And
yes.
As well as providing terrific information, they are quite funny and sassy in the way that they run their social media. Sorry, Chris?
You're not going to talk about the one from just the last couple of days where someone asked if they could draw certain appendages on their ballot paper?
Well, they did, and the response was sadly, yeah. It was yes, sigh.
It was a big sigh.
But they also went on to say, don't put any drawings inside the box. And because someone else actually asked, can I put a little note to thank the polling booth staff? And it was like, well, yes, you can, but don't interfere with your numbering. And I think there was also a question about Roman numerals. So people are really engaging, Chris.
Anything else that you've noticed in particular, Steve?
Well, Chris, I think anyone in local government for any length of time would have had that comment made to them about, I pay your wages.
Yes,
And
yes.
a week or two back, someone said to someone was quite miffed about what they saw as a bit of lightheartedness, and they thought that a government website should be a bit more serious, and ran the "I pay your wages, I don't pay you to be like this." The AEC Twitter account said, actually, we're trying to run an account that provides accurate information and draws people to read it, and our wages are paid by consolidated revenue.
Very good.
Yeah.
Full
Anyone
marks.
else you've noticed, Chris? Who else does good
Um,
stuff?
Vic Pol does good stuff on social media, I've noticed. A bit of humour at times, at the right times too. Obviously, some of the stuff is very, very serious, but I have noticed that in the past.
I think, and they do. They've got a bit of a history, and I think there was a bit of a spate there where the various state police forces were kind of competing to be a bit quirky on Twitter. So long may that reign. I should also plug one of the ones that I look at pretty regularly locally as a good social media account is my local water authority, Yarra Valley Water,
Oh, okay.
and they provide information about, when there's service disruptions and so on. But what they also do is provide information about other social issues, and it becomes a broader kind of news feed, if you like, Chris. So, there is an opportunity for authorities to be, or councils to be pretty creative in the way that they use their social media.
And you've put this hashtag in our show notes today, Steve. Your vibe attracts your tribe. Where does
Well,
that come from?
it just resonated for me, Chris. Someone I know just liked. It was an obscure LinkedIn post, would you believe, from a law firm in Gundawindi about a
Oh,
new employee, and just told a little story. And then at the bottom it said, "Your vibe attracts your tribe." And I was just thinking, in the terms of culture, whether we put out a positive vibe or the way that we respond to issues, the way that we run our organisations on a day-to-day basis, it is so true that we like attracts like, and there is a real opportunity to shift the tone by the way that we do our messaging, and often the external messaging becomes the internal messaging as well, Chris.
yeah. And look, just the very fact that we're talking about these agencies and the way they're using their social media, I think sends a message in and of itself that some people are starting to realise that using these channels in creative ways that connect with people really has an upside and gets their message through. There's far more cut through rather than perhaps the many that just used it as a very straightforward information
Yeah,
imparting tool without really thinking about how can we actually engage through
it's
these
far more than a notice board, Chris. Yeah.
yeah, that's a good way of putting it. All right, conscious of time, a few other things I wanted to mention quickly. We touched on this last week, the passing of the new legislation around the decriminalisation of sex work. We have reached out to our friends at Hunt and Hunt Lawyers, and I think next week we're going to have Tony on to talk a bit more about the implications for local government, Steve.
Yeah, and I understand Hunt and Hunt are preparing a memo to go out to all councils, which will talk about certainly the impacts for local laws and Planning and Environment Act. So, yeah, I look forward to talking with Tony Rounick next week on that, Chris.
Have you got a sense yet of how significant this is going to be in the way that councils function, particularly around local laws? I suspect is probably the key area, and planning enforcement.
Local laws is probably the one to start thinking about. That one of the implications, and Tony can talk about this some more, is that even if by accident the impact of a local law is to undermine the effect of the decriminalisation of sex work, then to that extent the local law will be invalid, even if it doesn't set out to do that. So
Mm.
there will be some implications for councils in terms of framing local laws. It's just another little compliance exercise to go past. The vagaries of the Planning Environment Act, I know there are some, and I think we'll need to be talking to Tony about that one.
All right, so look out for that next week. We're going to devote some time to it on our governance update 1 week from now. A couple of important things that are out there for review by the sector at the moment, and submissions are due at the end of the month. The culture review, of course, is one which we've talked about, and I know you and your colleagues at the VLGA have been spending some time thinking about how best to respond to this, Steve?
We're still thinking, Chris. So anyone that's got a submission that they've made who would like to send it through to us, we'd love to receive it. So we'll be finalising our submission this week, Chris, and it'll be posted on our website.
Terrific. Look forward to that. Another one that's happening in the same time frame is the review of the rules of the MAV. I know this is the different organisation to VLGA, but I think it's probably worth mentioning. The MAV's been around for a very long time, has its own act. They're looking at whether the rules need updating. You'll recall, Steve, there are some Supreme Court matters in recent years that highlighted some inconsistencies, I think, or some clarity required. So they're looking to clean that up. Issues around the presidency, board elections, membership, how state council functions, etc. So just a plug for that process and for councils to make sure that they contribute to that process before the 28th of Feb.
I think you and I, Chris, good for our friends at the MAV. It's a good thing for organisations to periodically review their rules, and I know it's sort of might be seen as tedious governance work, but everything's okay until it's not. So yeah, good on for doing the review.
And just on that, tedious governance work, I must say the discussion paper that they've put out is a really good read, Steve. If anyone hasn't had a look, it's not at all heavy. It's really interesting, and full marks to Celia Robinson, the manager of governance, who I know you know well at MAV, and Phil Shanahan, who's the lead consultant on that project, for bringing it to the point that it's at. So watch out for that. It'll be interesting to see the outcomes.
My word.
And the other thing we need to mention is Fast Track coming up on the 18th of March. You released a few extra places and they're filling up very fast.
That's true, Chris. We added another 10 and we're currently, I think, 78% subscribed. So people could do the math on that. Even with our extra 10, we would have been nearly full otherwise by now. So 18th of March, what I should mention is that our first speaker for the day will be the Minister, and the Minister is always really good at taking Q&A. So he has been very generous with his time. And I should actually, while I mention the Minister, note, I omitted the other week, Chris, when I was talking about YCCC, Your Country, Your Community, Your Council program that we're running at VLGA in regard to supporting First Nations people thinking of getting onto council, that of course is funded by Local Government Victoria. So props to the Minister and LGV.
Good plug. So 18th of March for Fast Track, details on the VLGA website. And the last thing I wanted to mention, Steve, and I'm not sure if there's anything else you want to raise today, is I just want to pass on some kudos to the regional councils in Victoria, led by Greater Shepparton, who came up with what I'm sure some thought was a harebrained idea in 2017, that we could have a Commonwealth Games in this state that was actually distributed around regional centres. Well, lo and behold, what's happened? There's only one party in negotiations for the Commonwealth Games in 2026, which is a bit sooner than they were thinking it might happen. And it looks like being a predominantly regionally distributed model of hosting the Games. I think that's just so exciting, and well done to those visionaries who had that idea 5 years ago.
Absolutely, Chris. And anyone that travels around rural and regional Victoria will know that there are fabulous sporting facilities. Oh, we're back on sport. And I've got to say, sometimes I am a bit sceptical about sporting events and the economic benefit and so on, but I think this will be just terrific for Victoria and for those regional centres.
Well, I think you'll probably see a lot of investment in facilities all around the state as a result of this, and you'll also probably see, I'm tipping, you're going to see people running the argument, stretching the definition of what is regional as opposed to metro to try and get a piece of this. Can I be controversial and suggest that?
I think if you leave that on the table, Chris, people will draw their own conclusions as to where you're coming from.
All right. Anything else you want to share with the audience before we depart for another
week? I think we're done, Chris.
Thanks, Steve. Steve Cooper is the Chief of Staff of the VLGA, and that's your governance update for another week, brought to you with our heartfelt thanks by Hunt and Hunt Lawyers. See you again next week for the governance update. Bye for now.